Hey kids, this is Ivan. Let me ask you a question. Do different game mastering styles affect how we ask questions in role-playing games? This is an excellent question asked by Rui Salto, hope I'm getting your name right, after I made a video about questions in role-playing games. So this is a great question about those questions. So let's back up. In that original video, I talked about three big umbrellas of how we tend to ask questions in role-playing games. The first one is very out of character. It's very much player asking the game master a question. What kind of armor are the goblins wearing? The second, it tends to be very in character, where the player is asking the game master questions about the environment via the interactions of the character with the environment. They're describing what they're doing and how they're looking. I go into the house, I go into the kitchen, I open all the cabinets, I open the cabinets under the sink. I'm looking for a metal wash basin or something big enough and fireproof that I can put this book in, submerge it with gasoline, and incinerate it and have the container not burn while I'm burning this book. Or we simply don't ask questions at all, and we insert things or situations into the environment or imagined situation. I go into the garage, I open the trunk of the car that's there, I take out a tire iron so I have something to defend myself with. Three different methods. How do we decide this, or how does the game master influence this? Well, first, hopefully we've had a session zero before we've started to play the game, and maybe as we've discussed things about the game, we've discussed how are we going to handle questions. Very often we don't, but sometimes we do. Maybe the group has come to a consensus. This is how we're going to do it. And maybe it's very prescriptive by a member or a group of members in the entire group that say this is how we're going to handle questions. So if you want to play in the game, this is how we're going to handle it. So going back to very out of character, how does the game master influence that? Well, sometimes it's simply that the game itself is very tactical, because I believe the players can influence this just as much as the game master. But it's a tactical game. Maybe the game master isn't really referring to your character Gork by their name at all. Maybe they're saying, "Hey, Ivan, this is there's a room and you see this, this, and this. What do you do?" And so I just end up asking Ed, how far away is that south wall? Very out of character. Very often these games can tend to be very tactical, where it's very much about the game. So the characters kind of take a back seat to the tactics that we're discussing, if you will, how we're handling the situation. It's not always, but very frequently. I find that for the out of character method of asking questions, this is where the game masters tend to be more influential or lead us in that direction if we're not already asking that questions that way. They tend to refer to the character by the character's name. They speak to the character rather than to the player. And then when the player ask a direct question of the game master or ask a very broad question, the game master will turn it on its head and ask, well, Gork, how are you looking for that? And so, that leads you to describe the actions of Gork or Henry or Terrence or whatever your character's name is. So very often, they can guide us in that direction. Sometimes it's unconscious on their part, but very often it's conscious. And they are trying to get us to ask questions in character. As far as not asking questions at all, in situations like that, very often the game master will turn things on its head. And when we ask a question, they'll ask us a question back. Well, what is in that cabinet? Or who is the person that's in that bar? Or why don't they like you? That sort of thing. And sometimes, you're playing a game where it's very prescriptive, that's exactly what you're supposed to be doing, is constantly asking the players questions about the environment. Sometimes the game doesn't say anything about that at all, but there's a culture of play that's developed around that game or that series of games where a lot of people just decide this is how you're supposed to do it, but you can't find it in the text if you're a new person. Conversely, very often there's other games where there's a culture of play that tends to dictate or assume that you can't insert things and you have to ask questions all the time. Maybe completely out of character, but it doesn't say that in the book either. You see how we bring our baggage to these games and it's more convoluted? But yeah, those are my observations about how game masters tend to influence how we ask questions, or don't ask questions in games. Very often it's kind of pushing us in different directions in terms of not asking questions at all, or asking questions in character. I don't believe in general, at least not in my experience, that game masters tend to push us towards asking questions completely out of character. Although I will say, there are psychological techniques of mirroring and matching and pacing and things where it becomes less and less comfortable to behave differently than everybody else at the table. So, a person like me who likes to or prefers to ask questions in character as much as possible may start to ask them completely out of character because everybody else is. So, there is a certain level of, when in Rome, do it, act as the Romans do, that sort of thing. But I'd like to hear your opinion on this. Have you used other techniques? Have you seen other techniques used? I think this is a much bigger subject than what I can comment on by myself. But those are the things I've seen in general. Really interesting topic. So thanks for the question, man.